Good morning and welcome to the fourth day of the 16th Vermont Organics Recycling Summit, organized by the Composting Association of Vermont in partnership with Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. The summit this year is being held in conjunction with International Compost Awareness Week, one of the largest outreach and education initiatives of the composting industry. And this year's theme is Recipe for Regeneration Compost. So we've been talking about all kinds of related topics this week so far, which has been great. I am Natasha Duarte, the director of the Composting Association of Vermont. Before we get going, I want to just give a huge thank you to our fabulous sponsors, without whom we would not be able to make this program, this week-long program, free of charge to all of you. So we really appreciate their support. Those include Community Bank, Eco Products, Vegware, Addison County Solid Waste Management District, Vermont Natural Ag Products, AgriLab Technologies, Compost Manufacturing Alliance, EcoPixel, Nature Cycle, the Vermont Produce Program of the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, and Wasted, Separating Waste, Connecting Communities. So thanks to all of them for helping us put on this fabulous week-long program. Before we get into today's program, I just wanted to let folks know about an initiative that the Composting Association of Vermont is part of, which is Lawn to Lake. We have a whole bunch of different partners. It's a coalition, and it started in 2016, really targeted to homeowners, but has expanded to businesses and municipalities. The goals of this are to reduce stormwater runoff and to improve plant and soil health. And it's been primarily through a social marketing campaign. And I'm going to just get out of these slides and share a very short video that we did related to this, just because I think it's a great example of some of the things that we've been talking about in terms of changing behavior and reaching out to folks.
Across the Lake Champlain Basin, grasses that grow in our lawns can help reduce the flow of pollutants to our waters. However, to do this, grass must be healthy with well-developed blades leading to long roots. This allows grasses to generate enough food for the rapid growth and dormancy periods they face. Grasses in the Lake Champlain Basin grow most rapidly in spring and fall, when temperatures are between 40 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. They reduce their speed of growth during the hottest part of the summer and are dormant in winter. The periods of high growth rates in spring and fall allow them to survive during more stressful periods. Like other plants, they generate food through photosynthesis by using their leaf blades to convert carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight into oxygen and glucose, a type of sugar plants use as food. Grass stores some of this sugar at the base of the plant for use in resting and dormant periods. Some sugar is also released from the roots, nourishing decomposers in the soil. When grass is routinely cut short to less than 2 inches, root growth is restricted as grass expends energy to regrow its blades instead of its roots. However, when grass is routinely cut to 3 inches and clippings are left, root mass and depth are enhanced over the growing season, improving soil health. The longer the grass blades, the more the grass will photosynthesize. The more developed its root system will become, and the more sugars it will make, store, and share with soil microbes. In turn, this helps soil microbes to decompose clippings and build soil organic matter, which allows soil to hold more water. Together, all these factors help increase the amount of rainwater that can sink into the ground, and in turn, reduce the amount of pollution that enters waterways. Do your part to protect local waters by raising your lawnmower blade to 3 inches and allowing grass clippings to decompose in place.
All right, so that was just a little promo, and that is something that we have been working on. Actually, we managed to get it on YouTube, but regional. So maybe some of you have even seen that as you have, if you watch YouTube videos. So it's supposed to be folks in the Lake Champlain Basin sort of get an opportunity to see that as an ad. And so anyway, with that shared, I would like to just remind folks or let folks know about the program today. We are going to be starting the day right now with the Food, Fiber, and Functioning Ecosystems, Vermont's Journey to Pay for Ecosystem Services. And then this afternoon is the ins and outs of on-farm composting. And just a reminder that this afternoon is our another in-person event at 3:30, which is a tour of Lamoille Soil Compost Facility up in Johnson. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for that. At this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite Maddie to share hers. And Maddie Kempner from NOFA Vermont is going to be sharing with us some of the work that she's been doing with the Payment for Ecosystem Services working group over the last year and a half or so. Maddie, I think it's been. And one of the things that I'll just say that I love about VORS Week is that there's so many interesting things happening in our state, and I just don't have time to participate in all of them. And Payment for Ecosystem Services is something that I've been sort of loosely following, but I'm very excited to have Maddie here to share what has been going on in our state. And so I can learn more and we can all see about how we can get involved. So Maddie, with that, please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Natasha. And I assume you can see my screen okay?
Perfect.
All right. Sorry for wiggling around there a little bit. So welcome, everybody. I'm really excited you all are here. And thank you so much, Natasha, for inviting me to participate and present at the summit this year. It sounds like you're having a great event so far. So congrats on that. I'm Maddie Kempner, and I'm the policy director at the Northeast Organic Farming Association of Vermont, or NOFA Vermont. I would love it just to learn a little bit more about who is here with us today. And if you have a moment, just while I'm giving a little bit of introduction and sort of talking about the flow of the presentation, if folks can put in the chat a little bit about yourself, just so we can sort of see who's with us today. If you could put in your name and where you're calling from or zooming from, and sort of your role in food, farming, composting, that would be really great, just so we can kind of get a sense of who's here. Also, it's exciting that there's a tour of the Lamoille composting facility today. Actually, I'm calling in, zooming in here from Cambridge, so right nearby there. So today I am excited to share a little bit with you all about Vermont's Soil Health and Payment for Ecosystem Services Working Group. I have served as a member of that working group since 2019 when the legislature initially created it. And so we've spent the past couple of years really getting into the details of developing a program. I'll get into sort of what Payment for Ecosystem Services is, some of the really complex considerations that go into developing a program like this, some of the questions that we've been asking, and some of them, that we've started to answer. And I will tell you also, I have planned a couple of breaks for discussion sort of throughout the presentation. So there's one about halfway through, and then we'll have some more time for discussion and questions at the end. So if you have questions that come up as I'm talking, please feel free to put them in the chat. And I think Natasha will very helpfully monitor that for me. And if there's anything that's really pressing, that's sort of a clarifying question that you need answered as I'm going through, hopefully Natasha can let me know about any of those. But otherwise, we can have some time for Q&A at those breaks that I've put in.
Yeah, thanks, Maddie. I forgot to say that up front, but I'm happy to be your voice. Don't feel like you have to hold your questions. I'll be monitoring the chat and pause for anything that needs to be clarified, and then also for those discussion periods.
Awesome. Thank you, Natasha.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so first, just a little bit about NOFA, in case folks are not familiar. We are a member-driven organization, and our mission is to promote organic practices to build a food system in Vermont that's economically viable, ecologically sound, and socially just. And our mission also says that benefits all living things. So we actually just celebrated our 50th year last year. We're 50 years old, founded in 1971, and we do a lot of different things in the food system. And I'll keep this brief because I know this isn't what we were to talk about, but just so folks are familiar, we do everything from direct farmer services, sort of business planning and technical assistance for producers, to food access programming. We run a lot of programs that are sort of at the intersection of food access and farm viability, including our farm share program, which provides subsidized CSA shares, and our crop cash program, which is sort of a double up food bucks farmers market program, things like that. We also, about a third of our staff work in organic certification. So we certify just under 800 farmers and processors in the state to the USDA organic standards through our certification program, which is Vermont Organic Farmers. And we do a lot of events and community building. That's a really core part of our mission. And we do policy and advocacy work, which is my role at NOFA. So a little bit about the PES working group. It was created through the passage of Act 83 in 2019. At the time, it was called the Soil Conservation Practice and Payment for Ecosystem Services Working Group, which is kind of a mouthful. It still is kind of a mouthful, but the name has changed slightly. And this is really important. I know this is a lot of like words on a slide, but this is essentially what the charge of the PES working group is. And it is to recommend financial incentives designed to encourage farmers in Vermont to implement practices that improve soil health, enhance crop resilience, increase carbon storage and stormwater capacity, and reduce agricultural runoff to waters. So I actually just wrote in the chat to Natasha that little lawn to lake video was kind of a perfect primer in some ways to what I'm going to be talking about, because it really touched on a lot of the ways that managing land, including lawns, can have a positive impact or a negative impact on soil health, which then can also lead to all of these other outcomes like carbon storage and, decreasing runoff. And the way that folks manage their land really has significant impacts on sort of how water moves across the landscape and a lot of the other kind of ecological functions that our landscape provides. So that was really interesting and really exciting for me to know that there's a program that directly is working with just homeowners, because the PES program is not really targeted toward that group. But that's an important part of our landscape, obviously. So importantly, also, I just want to share that our PES working group was initiated at the request of what were at the time Vermont's 3 farmers watershed alliances. I think we have at least one more that's emerged since 2019. But the farmers watershed alliances essentially wrote a letter to the legislature and to the administration and said, hey, we as farmers are contributing, to the public good in providing ecosystem services from our land management that we're not being compensated for. And we want Vermont to explore this idea of compensating farmers for some of those ecosystem services. So that is actually what led to the creation of this working group. And I think it's important to remember that this was actually sort of a farmer-led effort from the very beginning. Act 83 also established the membership structure of the working group and sort of said, these are the categories of people that will sit on this working group. And NOFA Vermont was appointed to the seat representing small-scale diversified agriculture. The rest of the working group is made up of, there's a seat for the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition, and Kat Buxton and Dee Dee Pershouse share that seat, who you all might, I think you heard from at least Kat or will be in the summit. There are seats for the 3 watershed alliances that initiated the working group, and there's seats for the Agency of Natural Resources, Agency of Agriculture, several environmental groups. So it's a pretty diverse group of stakeholders. So the initial work of the working group was from 2019 to sort of early 2020, which it was not a lot of time. I think we had just enough time. We started meeting in September of 2019, and we had just about enough time as a working group to go, oh, this is really complicated. We're going to need more than 6 months, which the legislature frequently does for folks who don't work in that sphere. They frequently will, give an assignment to a working group who has never met each other and may not have the right subject matter expertise to come back and develop a program in 6 months or a year that really deserves a lot more time than that. So we essentially came back to the legislature in 2020 and said, we need more time to do this right, and added some seats to the working group's membership that were missing and changed the name to the Payment for Ecosystem Services and Soil Health Working Group in recognition that soil health was a really core part of what we were trying to do. And I should just share also that our goal for the rest of this year is to finalize the program design, and I'll get into sort of some of the nitty-gritty of what that might look like, that will lead to the rollout of a pilot program in the next year or two. And really, I would say all or at least the majority of the working group has favored an approach to developing a PES program that's really modeled on sort of adaptive management or continuous improvement, where we'll roll out a pilot program that might be, somewhat basic at first. Farmers are really eager to get this thing going, and they're excited to, I think, see what we come up with, as is the legislature and maybe the public. But our hope is that will be continuously improved upon as we roll out a program and start to get feedback on how it's working or not working and what could be changed or added over time. So what are ecosystem services? This might really be review and might seem obvious to a lot of you, but I feel the need to sort of lay this foundation for what I'm talking about so that everyone is kind of going into this on the same page. There are a lot of different categories of there's 4 different categories that have been identified by the UN of ecosystem services, and those include cultural, provisioning, regulating, and supporting. And you can see in this really nice little circular chart here what some of those ecosystem services are. And essentially these services are values or services that are provided by nature or a functioning landscape to support human life, essentially. And so far, the PES and Soil Health Working Group has largely focused on some of the ecosystem services that you'll see under regulating and provisioning categories, actually that should say regulating and supporting. We've focused on soil health, nutrient cycling, flood mitigation, some of our charges that you read in the beginning, carbon sequestration, which is, reflected here as climate regulation. So, and in our economy, as you all are, I'm sure, aware, farmers are generally compensated just for their provision of food and fiber, and oftentimes not compensated adequately, I will say also. So these ecosystem services are really things that are provided for public benefit when farmers manage land in ways that support these outcomes. So that is what the PES Working Group is trying to sort of recognize and compensate folks for. The challenge and the area where we've really run up against a lot of complexity in trying to develop a program is exactly how to measure those outcomes, because you can't necessarily measure all of these outcomes coming off of every single farm or every single field in a given month or year. So also the question of sort of how to choose which ecosystem services farmers should be compensated for in order to develop a program that works, that isn't egregiously costly or complex, and that doesn't duplicate existing programs, because there are a lot of existing programs right now that pay for certain practices like installing a high tunnel or putting in fencing to keep livestock out of waterways or that kind of thing. So there is really a complex process involved of sort of trying to figure out what is already in place that are supporting these outcomes, and what role does a PES program have in sort of filling existing gaps in those programs. So one of the things that I, in my time on the working group, along with my colleague Becky Madden, who is a farmer down in Orwell, Vermont, she and her husband Scott Green run a small vegetable operation called Singing Cedars Farmstead, and she also does some work for U of M Extension with vegetable producers. She and I have been sharing the seat on the working group for the past year or a little more, and she and I have really advocated for an approach to paying for ecosystem services that focuses heavily on biodiversity, in addition to the focus on soil health that's been pretty well established in the working group. And I think, one of the reasons that we have focused so much on biodiversity is that by incorporating that focus, we really feel that we're going to be able to move toward functioning ecosystems that can provide multiple ecosystem services, as opposed to only, for example, focusing on measurements of in-field soil health, which are important and great, as sort of that Lawn to Lake program touched on, but don't necessarily have as many synergistic benefits and don't necessarily lead to an overall more functional ecosystem. So this list that I put in here, you can see the sort of positive indicators. This is from an organization that we have worked with a little bit actually at NOFA and VOF called Wild Farm Alliance, that does a lot around how to promote biodiversity and enhance biodiversity on organic farms in particular, because organic farmers are required to promote biodiversity in their practices. And so Wild Farm Alliance has been an incredible resource specifically within organic farming around how to promote biodiversity, but a lot of what they have done can really be applied to any type of farm. And so we have used a lot of their resources to bring in these ideas of how biodiversity can be enhanced and sort of measured. So they have this excellent document that's called Positive Indicators and Red Flags, and it really goes through sort of on all different types of farms and at every sort of level of the farm ecosystem, in-field, edge of field, and whole farm. What are some things that we're looking for that show us that biodiversity is really present? in ways that can lead to the provisioning of these ecosystem services, and what are some red flags that show that it may not be, and that farms are really managing in a more reductionist way. So these are some of the indicators that they have called out. We've really appreciated you being able to use their resources. The next one, the next resource that we've used around biodiversity, and this is, don't get too caught up in any of these graphics here. I'll sort of talk through what they are. Don't feel like you need to read any of these words, but this tool is a fascinating one. It's called the Healthy Farm Index. And essentially what it does is allow a farmer to work with a service provider and or a research team to sort of set targets around biodiversity and ecosystem services that are really applicable and appropriate to their farm scale, geography, surrounding habitat, production type, and sort of choose, these are the things that I want to be measuring on my farm and make sure that I'm improving, that are going to feed positively into my management plan. And then this tool allows them to essentially go back and collect data to measure those outcomes, and get a score to track their progress over the years on how they're doing at improving their biodiversity and ecosystem services. So we loved this tool and sort of the research and information that comes along with it, because it really focuses a lot on farmer participation in setting these targets. And we have, Becky and I and a lot of other folks on the working group have emphasized that farmer participation in this process of goal setting is really critical, because so much of, these outcomes working depends on farmers' own skill and knowledge of, their own farm. And again, all of those factors that influence sort of what is the appropriate approach for a given farm. So this tool was really exciting for us to come across, and has led to some more of the work that we've done to put together proposals for the working group. Again, another very wordy and complicated graphic that you can largely ignore, but this I just share because Becky and I have done some work actually just in the past couple of weeks to put together proposals for what some of the indicators look like, especially when we're talking about biodiversity. I think a lot of the folks in the working group do have a ton of experience working in soil health and in all the different testing and metrics that are really emerging in the research community right now around soil health. I don't think there has been as much experience or expertise or time spent among a lot of the food and farming community, honestly, around this focus on biodiversity. So Becky and I went through and we actually borrowed this matrix from matrix that the state uses for RAP's compliance, which is the required agricultural practices, and sort of tweaked it to be applicable to biodiversity. So you can see here just some of the indicators that we're looking at are things like diversity and abundance of adjacent habitat like woodlands, wetlands, hedgerows, alleys. Does the farm have conservation areas mapped or practices or plans in place for conservation? Do they allow, the buildup of things like brush piles, logs, patches of bare soils, or a healthy duff layer that can be indicative of the kinds of habitat that they're providing in the edges of their fields or in kind of the wooded or wetland areas of their farm. Those are all some indicators that are really easily observable by farmers. And our idea with this matrix is sort of allowing farms, in concert with a service provider, to set a baseline, set some targets around where they're at with any of these indicators in the first year that they enroll in the program. And the idea is they would, do a walk on their farm, document sort of where they are in all these areas, how much of this they have going on already, and make a plan to improve upon it. And we see these indicators, for example, beneficial insects and birds in field. That kind of indicator can really help a farm determine, how much they're relying on natural methods of pest control by beneficial species that exist on their farm, as opposed to relying on chemical inputs, for example, to manage pests. So let's see. So the way that, and part of the reason also that we put together this matrix is that the way that we measure and collect data in this program is really important. We want to develop, and by we, I'm saying, me and Becky, and I think a lot of other folks on the working group as well, want to develop indicators that are useful to farmers and measure the outcomes that they're producing from their farms in a way that actively supports them in meeting their management goals. For example, if all we rely on for this program are tools like remote sensing technology that are relying on satellite images to sort of model what's happening on the landscape in these sort of more macro ways, that doesn't necessarily help farmers or create this positive feedback loop where farmers can benefit from the data that's being collected and actually use it to inform the practices that they're using on the ground. So our goal in developing this matrix is really to create a system that is actively working to support farmers in their own management, and that's relatively low in terms of administrative burden for farmers as well. You can see in this column on the far right, the sort of reporting tools that we are hoping to use in this program, at least in part, are things like farmers submitting maps of their practices on their fields and photos documenting certain indicators like, bird species or diversity of crops in their pasture, things like that, and submit those photos from year to year to show kind of how they've been improving. Okay, I think we have made it to the first discussion break. So I'll just start by saying, as you can see, from these slides, this is complicated. And we often hear from legislators and farmers and members of the public that they feel like this is taking a long time and they haven't seen much progress. And my hope with this presentation is in part to give you some sense of the complexity of the questions that we are trying to ask and answer in this work. So thanks for bearing with all that information, and I'd love to hear if there's any questions so far.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great point, Maddie. And that was one of the things that Maddie and I talked about in terms of like wanting to make sure we're all sort of on the same page to begin with. And, for some of us, it's a payment for ecosystems is, we hear about, but we don't really know what it means, or, or maybe we do, but we have a different interpretation of how to actually move that forward. And so I really appreciate your taking the time to sort of walk us through and get us up to speed. We did have a bunch of folks typing in who they are. So we have some EPA, Food Waste Research Fellow, compost operators. Let's see, and feel free to scan through as well. I don't see any specific questions. Well, one, we're interested in, so another EPA person says, we're interested in environmental and economic value of compost when used for a variety of ecosystem services. So I think that's, certainly one of the angles.
Yeah.
And I imagine you'll be getting a little bit more into that.
I will touch on some of that a little bit later on. So just some things to be thinking about, and folks can either respond to, I have some sort of prompting questions that you could either respond to in the chat, or you could just, marinate on these as I go through the rest of my presentation. But first of all, I think to back up, what is your perception of this idea of paying farmers and other land managers for ecosystem services? Does that idea make sense to you on its face? Is that something that you feel is sort of missing in the way that our farm and food economy is structured that makes sense to be compensating folks for? And if so, in your role, what ecosystem services do you think the public should value or pay for that we're not currently, and how do we decide? Because you saw in that initial chart that I put out the variety of services that are provided by functioning ecosystems, and to develop a program that pays for all of those things is not really practical in our given system. So there really are a lot of key and very impactful decisions to be made about which services we decide to prioritize and value in this sort of, monetary sense. So those are some things. I see a question.
Yeah, one question that came in was curious why bare ground is good for bees and other insects. They've heard that covering ground is always good, so it doesn't dry out and leak nutrients, and that the parasitoid wasps beneficial.
Yeah, so I will say to begin with that I am not a biologist, so I don't know all of the details of like which species are beneficial on farms and not. But my impression, I believe, is that patches of bare ground can be good for certain species, yes, of like nesting bees. And there are some bees that actually do nest in the ground, and other types of insects that nest in the ground that may need bare soil to actually make those nests. So I think, and in general, your point is well taken that there is a very clear soil health principle that says that ground should be covered, preferably with living green cover, right, at all times. So that is a little bit counterintuitive, but it sort of speaks to again, the complexity of this and sort of the diversity of landforms and habitat types that we want to see farmers encouraging and allowing for. And yeah, I do think there are some beneficial wasp species, like parasitic wasps, that will feed on pests, on farm pests. And we want to encourage more reliance, obviously, on beneficial insects and other modes of pest control as opposed to chemical inputs. So that's sort of the broad strokes of where that's going.
Yeah, thank you. And folks, feel free to keep putting stuff in if you'd like. I'll just add quickly that I really liked in that matrix you showed, Maddie, sort of seeing that a lot of you talked about lowering sort of the administrative barriers for farmers. And that's something that I've talked to some farmers I work with about. And I really appreciate that, because farmers are already busy and doing so much for us. And so we're not trying to be like, and here's one more thing, and here's one more thing. And like all of a sudden you have to find extra time in your day to provide, to justify or to verify that you're providing these. And I know some of what I've heard from a soil health point of view is that, some of the soil health metrics that are used in research and other things can be, like the soil testing for that can be burdensome. And so I'm really interested to hear more about, sort of maps and observations that can be done while farmers are in their fields, as opposed to just a 100% reliance on those like concrete lab derived numbers. And so, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, Natasha. Those are really, really good points and things that we've talked about a lot. And, I think it's going to end up, my hope is that it will end up being a combination of these things. Even when it comes to these indicators that Becky and I put together for that matrix, it's not that every farm is going to check all of those boxes or get to a place where they're, meeting the sort of highest level of achievement of all of those indicators, but say you are working toward improvement on 3 out of 5 of them in a given year, and you can sort of choose what those 3 are based on those factors that are specific to your farm. And we've heard from farmers, and I'll get into this a little bit more. There's been a research team that's been conducting some farmer outreach. We've heard that some farmers are really interested in those more complex, lab tests and advanced soil testing. And so that also can be a part of this program, absolutely, and should be for folks that want that and can benefit from it. But farmers may have different priorities and things they're hoping to get out of this. So my hope is that we can develop something that's flexible enough to meet those different needs.
That's great.
All right, well, moving on. So this is a big question that we've been grappling with in the PES work. Are we paying for practices, or are we paying for outcomes, or is it some combination of the two? So most existing conservation programs that are operated by NRCS, which is the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is an agency under the USDA, pay farmers for certain practices, like putting in a high tunnel or planting cover crops or having a rotational grazing plan. And so a lot of the existing conservation programs sort of work in that way of paying for specific practices, basically on the assumption that they will lead to certain outcomes that are beneficial for, the farm or the surrounding community or the environment. And sort of in part because we don't want to duplicate those existing programs that are working well, in large part for farms, and because we want this program to recognize, as I've talked about, and rely on farmers' own expertise about their own land and farming system. The working group has really focused on developing a program that is paying for specific outcomes. And also it helps, make sure that we are really meeting those legislative charges and the goals of the program if we can tie this directly to outcomes, measured or modeled, rather than practices that we are sort of assuming will get us there. In many ways, though, this focus on trying to be so strictly focused on outcomes makes designing this program a lot more complex, and could also actually risk it becoming too reductionist depending on the outcomes and how they're measured. As we've talked a little bit about, if we, for example, only develop a program that relies on in-field, soil health tests, that can tell us a certain amount about how that farm is functioning and the ecosystem services that it provides, but it doesn't necessarily give us the whole picture. So how do we develop a program that is really focused on the right outcomes, while again, not being overly administratively burdensome, either for farmers or for program administrators? Because our goal also with this program is to, as much as possible, have the funding for the program be paying producers directly, and compensating for them for these improvements and for these services, as opposed to paying a lot of sort of service providers and bureaucrats to administer the program. So that's another challenge that we face. So I'm going to get into a little bit, some additional examples of proposals that have come from folks in the working group and folks that have been tracking the working group, that have provided some ideas about how this could be done. Oh no, another chart with a lot of words. I always get really overwhelmed when people put things like this up in a presentation, because I feel like I have to read everything. So don't feel like you have to read all the words again on this slide. But this is a really, really interesting and I think pretty brilliant proposal that was put forward by some farmers and service providers and researchers that were sort of tracking the progress of the working group and trying to think about how to develop a program that is meaningful and works for farmers. The name that they have come up with for this proposal is CSP Plus. So if you ever hear anybody talking about that name in the PES world, this is what they're referring to. And the idea of this is that it is based on a program that is run by NRCS right now called the Conservation Stewardship Program, which largely is doing good things, but there are some shortcomings to folks being able to access that program and it really reaching a variety of farmers, including sort of historically underserved farmers, small and beginning farmers. And so this proposal is in part taking what's good about that program and building in some of those factors that address the barriers to entry, for example, and that make it a little bit better. So the basic idea behind this CSP Plus proposal is at the top here, you see the sort of base pay. And it would essentially include what was envisioned as a somewhat of a universal basic income for farmers. So if farmers are meeting sort of baseline requirements in terms of not violating the required agricultural practices, meeting basic BMPs for their farm size and type, they would be eligible to enroll in this program and receive this kind of base payment that just comes along with some technical service provision, some data collection, and some conservation planning, for example. And so that's kind of the most basic level. And then moving up from there, there are sort of these different layers that can be built on, or tiers, which farmers have expressed a lot of support and interest in, that compensate farmers at increasing levels based on. This one relies on a combination of practices and outcomes. So it's at the beginning at the sort of steward and soil builder level. It's a little bit more based on practices, like you see here, crop rotation, manure injection, cover cropping. So they would get a payment if they're doing some of those practices that we, have some knowledge that they are providing the outcomes that we want, including slowing the flow of water, carbon sequestration, things like that. And then as you get more toward this regenerative level, you're sort of building, stacking functions on each other so that when you get to this higher level where the payment is increased, you have demonstrated that you're meeting those, practice requirements, and you can demonstrate specific outcomes in terms of water retention and hopefully, wildlife habitat provision and things like that. So this is one proposal that's been put forward by farm. It was really developed by a farmer up in Highgate Center named Guy Schwanier, who's a dairy farmer, an organic dairy farmer, along with some other folks. And it's gotten some good traction in the working group. And I think generally is an approach that we've seen support from farmers for. So I would love to share, and I actually had invited one of the researchers on the UVM team who has done a lot of the research and farmer outreach for this program design to present with me, and he wasn't able to make it, but I'm going to share a little bit of his findings because I do think that some of that feedback from farmers has been really critical. So some of these kind of high level insights from that research team, as we've talked about the administrative burden of this program and how intensive that's going to be in terms of paperwork and data collection is really an important consideration for farmers and influences their decision to participate in the program. One sort of comparative situation I could share, and they talked about this with the farmers that were interviewed and did the surveys that they conducted, is organic certification. And again, that's one of the things that we do as an organization, and we've heard this forever, that organic certification really works well for some farmers in that the additional record keeping that they're required to do, annual inspections that they have to do to be in compliance with the organic standards and to be able to use the organic label, that really works for some farmers. It really helps them reach the markets that they want to reach, helps them get a higher price point for their products. And in a lot of ways, we hear from farmers that record keeping actually makes them better managers, even though it feels like, an additional process they have to do, it really helps them with their decision making and just helps their management in so many ways. So that's the sort of positive. And then on the flip side, that record keeping is not necessarily worth it for some farmers, and the additional price point they can get may not be worth the extra work they have to put in to get that organic label. So I think similarly with this program, if we can design something that has a reasonable degree of record keeping and data collection associated with it, it's a voluntary program, just like organic is. So folks can choose whether or not it's worthwhile for them to participate, and based on the sort of payments that they would get out of it. So secondly, this is very interesting to me and really important. Farmers that were interviewed and took the survey generally were really resistant to the idea of being paid to maintain their soil health. So if you ask farmers, should you be paid to maintain the level of soil health essentially that you're achieving right now, folks generally say no, because that is just something that is so inherent to what they see as their job, as a farmer. Caring for their soil is so important to raising good crops and raising healthy animals that being paid just to maintain that soil health is not something that makes sense to folks, because they feel like that's just a part of what they're doing. Farmers generally were more able to consider being paid to improve or enhance their soil health. And, that really works into that system of kind of the tiered model, where if you can show sort of improvements toward these certain thresholds year after year, you would get an increasing level of payment and recognition of that. And this was interesting because the researcher, Noor, who did some of this work with farmers, talked about how farmers could imagine, okay, if I'm going to improve my soil health, that might involve purchasing this piece of equipment, for example, or increasing the complexity of my crop rotations. And farmers can start to imagine sort of what those costs are for them and how they might be compensated for that kind of thing. The fourth one over here on the right side, farmers support co-eligibility and data transfer with existing programs. This is something we've emphasized a lot, trying to make sure that if farmers are signing up for a PES, a Payment for Ecosystem Services program, that we make this program work well in conjunction with things like existing NRCS programs with organic certification. So if a farmer is already participating with an existing agency or organization in those ways, that their data can sort of be collected in one place, and it can sort of build on some of those existing relationships as opposed to sort of reinventing the wheel for this new program. So that was really important. And then there was strong farmer approach for this, strong farmer support for the tiered approach, as we've talked about, and that was sort of laid out in the CSP Plus program. And then they found that most farmers find value in sort of good PR from participation. So there may be some element in this, and I think likely there should be some element in a PES program of public recognition for farmers that are participating, because one of the things that we have not done a lot of work on and that we're not necessarily charged with doing in this PES framework is, public awareness and public willingness to pay for these things, because this will be a sort of a new requirement for the public to pay in to support some of these services that farmers are not being compensated for now. So there really is a pretty important kind of public perception element of this, where we need to make sure that we're creating a program that the public is willing to pay for, and that and farmers find value in that too, that the public recognizes their efforts and thinks that they're important. Okay. Next. So some lessons learned from this working group, and these are some pretty critical ones, and I think there's still a lot more work to be done. to address some of these things. Representation matters. This probably doesn't surprise anyone, that representation is important. But I will say, in particular, a way this has played out, the working group has not had significant representation from or a seat designated for Vermont's Indigenous communities or other people of color, for example. And, we have heard a perspective from one Indigenous person who has come to some of the working group meetings, that this concept of paying for ecosystem services really doesn't even make sense from an Indigenous worldview, or at least from that person or that community's worldview. From their perspective, these services that we're referring to are gifts that nature provides, that the earth provides. And that concept just doesn't really jive with what we're doing here, because you don't pay for gifts. So the idea that we're creating this sort of transactional system where, land managers or farmers or others are being paid for these things that, an Indigenous perspective, at least in the way this one person put it, are gifts, just doesn't really make sense. At the same time, we do live in a capitalist economy that is currently structured in a way that can be incredibly extractive, right? And does a lot of damage to our natural resources. So this type of program can really be seen as a bridge in some ways from the economy that we have to the one that we might want to create in the future. And it sort of can be viewed, if it's done well, I think, as a step in the right direction to sort of internalize and include some of these public benefits into our economy that are not currently accounted for right now. The second lesson, and these are really just like my lessons learned. I'm sure if you talk to any member of the working group, they might have different things to say here about the lessons that we've learned so far, and hopefully we'll continue to learn and improve upon. Language matters. So the statutory language, this is always a challenge when writing legislation. Statutory language is limiting. It's really good that it's limiting in some ways so that we kind of know the universe of charges that we are expected to work on, who's going to be on the working group and really what we're charged to do. That is necessary to some degree to have those kind of guardrails on this process. It also can be really challenging and hard to get right the first time. So for me, for example, in trying to emphasize, biodiversity as a really important part of this, program, and sort of a means to an end in some ways, in that I think biodiversity is an indicator, again, of these sort of synergistic impacts in a fully functioning ecosystem. Biodiversity is not in our statutory charges. It's nowhere mentioned in the language that created the PES working group. So one of the things that I have, run into in trying to make sure that biodiversity is a focus is sometimes a response that's not part of our charge, which is, technically true when you look at the language, but I think that a really strong argument can be made that biodiversity is a critical way to be able to get at what those statutory charges are. And if we don't focus on it, we might end up with a program that really improves in-field soil health measurements and helps farmers score better on those sort of advanced soil testing metrics, but it could lead us down a path that will not necessarily lead to overall a more functional and diverse landscape. And so that's kind of my fear with some of the language. And we have not gone back and actively addressed either of these things through statutory changes, which we could in theory have done, right? We could designate a seat for an Indigenous person or other people of color on the working group, and we could change the statutory language to include biodiversity. And there's various reasons, I guess, that we haven't done that, but it's important to remember that legislation and policymaking is still a human process, and we can always, and it should be an iterative process. So my hope is that we can address some of those things going forward. Third, again, no surprise to anyone, but facilitation really matters. And skilled facilitation is critical in this process to make sure that differing opinions can be heard, that power dynamics are adequately accounted for, and that people feel their time and input is valued. If there are power dynamics at play in the group where, some folks have more power than others and people don't necessarily feel that their input is being heard, that does not create an environment where folks, continue to want to show up for every other week meetings, and especially for farmers that serve on this working group, which it's so great that they are there, making sure that their time is being valued so that they are encouraged to continue showing up is really critical. And it's a really challenging thing to do sometimes. So we do have a facilitator hired to, run the meetings, and that has been really important in helping us get as far as we have, but it's not without its challenges. And then lastly, I'll just say, community engagement really matters. And again, that seems obvious, but the way that a group or a facilitator does community engagement is really important. And it's not a simple thing. For example, when we're asking farmers for their input on a PES program, it's been really important to approach farmers at the right time with enough information for them to kind of give us informed input. Because I'll give an example. So at the very beginning of the PES process, we as NOFA hosted a series of events on soil health that were just sort of part of our regular on-farm workshops that we do every summer. And as part of those events, we asked some questions about PES and soil health and how farmers wanted to see this go. And it was really challenging to get meaningful input from farmers because the questions were too open-ended, right? There was no proposed program that they could sort of respond to and chew on and decide what makes sense to them and what was important to them in the program. So, and then through several times throughout the working groups process, we have kind of done that work, or the researchers have done that work of deciding kind of when it's a good time, when we have enough information to go to farmers and say, hey, what do you think about this? And how much, can we pay you to do this, to produce this kind of outcome? And I think we're getting to the point now where the research team has been able to do that outreach in a way that's gotten meaningful input, but that has been a challenging thing. The other thing I will say about community engagement is we have not done a lot of engagement with the broader public who is going to be paying for this program. So what does that process look like? And how do we know that what we're doing is going to lead to something that the public actually wants to pay for? Because at the end of the day, we all will be, right? So I'm hoping that we can do more of that going forward. And continuous improvement is actually a principle that's really embedded within the organic standards and regulations, that the idea is that farms themselves will be continuously improving and sort of making their crops, their animals, and their landscapes healthier by improving their practices, but also that the process itself and the regulations themselves continuously improve. So my hope is that this PES program can kind of follow a similar philosophy and have similar outcomes. And I think that's all I have for sort of talking at you. So I would love to open it up. That was a lot of me talking. And I would love to hear what your thoughts are, what your questions are, and things that we should be considering. I'll end on this slide and this last one. If anybody wants to get in touch with me for any reason, I can put this up again at the end. I'm going to stop the share so we can sort of see each other, and invite folks to turn your videos on if you can. But this is my contact info. If anybody ever wants to get in touch, I can put this back up at the end, or maybe Natasha can share it out.
You can share it out for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, Maddie. A lot to chew on. It's great to get a download from you about all the work that's been happening in our state. John does ask in chat, how can we frame a payment for ecosystem services conversation with the large players in the Midwest, mainly corn and soy growers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, right now, our state program, the program that we're developing is just looking at farms in Vermont. But I do think that what we do in Vermont will have ripple effects and will have impacts across the country, because we are one of the first states to really tackle this issue. We are kind of doing it with that in mind, that what we do sets the stage for what might happen in our region and other parts of the country. So it's a really valid question. I will also say, in terms of those bigger kind of conventional monocrop farms, there are lots of efforts, I think, at the national level right now to stand up these kinds of programs. And some of those efforts are really funded by big agribusiness, like the General Mills and the JBS, and, the big agribusiness players do sort of, I think, see the writing on the wall and want to get in on some of this opportunity. And in part, that plays out at the national level as carbon markets and cap and trade programs, where I think there is a real, potential bent toward those more corporate interests. So I'll just say, like, we're sort of doing this in our little corner of Vermont in a certain way. And if we can do something that really incorporates biodiversity, for example, I think that will be really different than how this plays out in a lot of the rest of the country. And so I can't really speak to how our program would deal with those types of farms because they're just at such a different scale. But I will say, I think what we're hoping to do in Vermont is develop a program that can have some entry point for any type of farmer. My hope actually is that, like, even a continuous corn farmer can find some ways in this program to sort of say, oh, I could do this. You know, I could plant more diverse buffers, for example, and plant like native bushes and trees in my buffer zones. And, oh, I can, you know, find ways, maybe I'll plant a multi-species cover crop as opposed to a single species cover crop, right? Like, my hope is that there will be something for everyone, and it will include something for those people who have been doing this for a long time, those sort of smaller scale organic regenerative producers who haven't really gotten recognition necessarily for the work that they do. They can also look at this and go, okay, I'll get sort of this base payment to participate. And then if I can, like, raise the bar and make progress in certain areas, there's still something there for them too. So that's my sort of vision personally.
Yeah, Maddie, and I really like that, because one of the things I hear frustration in at some of the farm to plate gatherings and conversations that I have been a part of around payment for ecosystem services is it's incentivizing people who've been doing a really bad job, or potentially incentivizing people who've been doing not such a great job, we'll say, to try to do better. And that's super important. But in at least some of the earlier conversations, folks who had been already really diligently trying to do the best that they can were feeling like, we're not recognized, we're not going to get paid for this. Like we've already made, you know, our own personal sacrifices and investments in some of these practices, and there wasn't really a place for that. So I really like sort of the tiered approach where folks can get engaged and, you know, at multiple or at various levels.
Yeah, and we talk about that a lot in the working group. That was one of the first things that we sort of set as our foundation, was that question. And this is sort of in the, like, academic circles around PES, that it's framed as this question of additionality, meaning, like, what's the biggest bang for your buck? How much are you improving based on these payments? And how much is the public really getting for their money, right? Which, if focused on additionality entirely, would require focusing on those producers who have not been doing the best job, right? And incentivizing them to do better, versus equity is kind of the other side of that coin that you're talking about, which is like, what is the recognition of people who are already doing this? The other thing I would just say in response to that particular topic, and I know we have some other things in the chat, is that existing conservation programs, especially run through NRCS, really focus on operations that have an existing, what's called a resource concern, or like a problem that needs to be solved. So my theory is that most of the programs that we have actually operate on that model of cleaning up problems versus incentivizing really best practices and transformational change. So because we already have all of those programs that are focused on resource concerns, we don't need to really necessarily do more of that. There are already a lot of programs that can help farmers kind of clean up issues. And honestly, sometimes that focus on resource concerns creates a perverse incentive. And we hear this from farmers that, like, I actually have to create a problem on my farm in order to get funding to put in this fence, as opposed to something that will pay them to sort of actively do the right thing, even if they don't have a problem. So I'm hoping more on that transformational end of things.
That's great. So Dan says in chat, it seems like Vermont's dairy farmers would see the most potential for improved ecosystem services versus, say, organic veg farms that are more likely already checking many of these boxes. Is there an estimate on what the breakdown of participation might look like in our state? And he goes on, so I'll just add this, that's kind of tying into what we were just talking about. And he adds also, is there any estimate on what a total financial cost could be for the state if ideally every farmer were to someday participate at something above the base level?
Yeah, those are all really great questions that we don't really have great answers for yet. There's so many of these program details still being worked out. And again, I think there is an interest in the working group in making sure that this can work for all types and scales of farmers. And I think you're right that like there are certain types of farms that are more likely to be checking many of these boxes, but that also can still make progress in certain areas. It's not as if every organic vegetable farm is like the most diverse sort of like permaculture, agroecological food forest, right? So I think there are still like ways for those farms to kind of level up and actively focus on biodiversity. And we've even discussed, this is actually, it's interesting, there's sort of this convergence happening where we are talking a lot within Vermont organic farmers about ways that within our organic certification program, we can do more to promote biodiversity because our guidelines are sort of limited in that respect right now. I think one way that we're going to get to see what program participation looks like is actually just through this pilot program. I think by developing a program design and putting it out in the first couple of years and making sure that we have enrollment from a diversity of farms in terms of scale, geography, years in business, production type, organic and conventional, we will start to get a sense of sort of who this program works for, how it's used by different types of farms. And that might help us start to answer some of your other questions about sort of total financial costs with program participation. The other question that we have not yet answered is, will farmers continuously get a payment? Right? Is this payment ongoing, in perpetuity, or is there a certain number of years that a farmer signs a contract for and they have to demonstrate improvement for, say, that 5-year contract, and then they reassess? Or, we haven't answered any of those really detailed programmatic questions yet, which are really important ones that will also lead to some of these financial answers.
Yeah. Just to stay on that financial theme for a minute, one of the things that I just learned about yesterday at Linda's funding your compost operation session, she brought up impact bonds for payment for ecosystem services that are outcomes based. And I don't really know that much about them. And it's fine if you don't either, Maddie, but I just thought I'd ask it, to see, and that's like a national bond kind of system, but I'm really not familiar with that at all. And I sort of jotted it down as something to look into more.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's not something I know a lot about either. And that it again sort of points to the complexity of the questions that we're asking here. And how do you have all the right expertise in the room? Because when we get into that discussion of sort of financing mechanisms, like we need probably several economists actually in this group, and we don't have any right now that I know of. So, I have heard bonds thrown out in our group as well as a potential way to pay for this kind of thing. There's also folks that have brought up the idea of like a public banking system as being integral to, making this kind of system work. And that would just be such a huge departure from what we have right now. So bonds might be a little bit more of a realistic system, but again, we haven't even gotten there, and we've been working at this for 2+ years. So yeah, for sure. I think the other piece that's really interesting, you started talking a little bit at that, that piece of the getting the public involved that you guys haven't quite gotten there yet, but I think the Composting Association of Vermont, we're just starting it's a USDA funded project to work with farmers interested in sort of community focused or community oriented food scrap composting on their farms. And one of the things that in doing sort of the prep for that and getting that going and speaking with those farmers, like I hear a lot about people like the public don't even know what it really, like they need to get onto a farm. They don't even really know what it means to be a farmer and what, just that. We're trying to build out some parts of that program to help, that are just much broader sort of public education and outreach, which of course you guys do, Farm to Plate does, there's Farm to School. We have all these different initiatives. And yet one of the sort of pinch points I keep hearing about is like, people need to understand better what the role that farms play in our communities, and not just, I'm trying to get the best price for my salad greens, or why is local more expensive? And, we get into those conversations, but what are, how do we communicate with the public in a meaningful way, and ideally in a collaborative way, that people can really recognize
the full suite of services of
Yeah.
keeping that working landscape intact and supported. And what that, like, if that went away, what would, we would all feel the impact of that, but because it's there, it's largely not seen, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that speaks a little bit, that last thing you said, Natasha, these are
Mhm.
all such important points that, we've
Mhm.
some about in the working group,
Mhm.
but we can talk about more. But the last thing you said, in terms of just those types of things that we take for granted that farms provide that we don't necessarily always appreciate, we don't have to pay for them right now. One of those is really a cultural service in like the aesthetic of Vermont, right? I mean, I live in Cambridge and my kids go to daycare up in Fletcher, and I pass, I think, 5 or 6 farms in the 10-minute drive between my house and my kids' daycare up in Fletcher. Most of those are dairy farms. And farms really do a huge service in terms of just like our culture in Vermont, keeping our land open, providing access to recreation. Like, I'm a mountain biker, and a lot of the mountain bike trails that I access start at farms. And so I think that's one, sort of cultural service that goes oftentimes, under recognized or underappreciated. In terms of how we develop a program that really incorporates that kind of collaborative public perception and public understanding piece, that was another thing that Becky and I, when we were developing that list of proposed indicators, another thing we talked about in terms of that data collection effort is, if we create a program that relies on farmers' observations and them submitting maps and photos of these indicators and how they're improving their biodiversity, for example, over time, those things can then be fed into sort of a public education campaign where we have a lot of photos submitted from farms that are showing, hey, here's all this great, bird habitat. Here are the pollinators I'm seeing on my farms. Here's what my cover crop looks like when it's flowering and providing habitat and forage for bees, that then can be real visual indicators for the public of why they're paying for this and what they're getting out of it. Because again, things like, and I think there's definitely a place for this and it's super important, but those more, lab-based soil health tests, they don't have that same ability to sort of easily translate to the public what's happening on farms and what it means for our overall health. And then the other thing I would just say that we've talked about in terms of program design that the California Healthy Soils program does is demonstration projects. So a certain amount of their funding actually goes to support demonstration projects where, my hope would be not only farmers can come and learn from each other about what they're doing that's working to provide ecosystem services, but the public ideally would be able to access those demonstration projects too. So those are some ideas that we talked about.
And schools or groups, folks. That it's interesting you bring up California. John in the chat asked if California is close behind Vermont with a program like this.
Yeah, that's a good question. California doesn't, I don't think, have a PES, a Payment for Ecosystem Services program, but they do have a Healthy Soils program, which I was just referencing, and that's been in place for several years now. I can't remember exactly when the first year of it was, but it is really interesting. It is definitely a pay for practices program. So if you look up the California Healthy Soils program, they actively pay farmers to implement practices, some of which are already paid for by NRCS, but they sort of have created a parallel program where they say you can either apply for these through NRCS if you have an existing contract or if NRCS works better for you, or you can apply and get payment for these through the state. And I think their program design just works to sort of integrate those. Composting is a big one that they actually pay directly for in California. And it's really funny. We had somebody from the, I think, California Department of Food and Ag or something come present to our working group. And they talked about how this is one of the things they do in their program is have farmers submit photos, time-stamped photos of them doing these practices. So they literally have farmers like send photos of themselves spreading compost on the fields as a way of reporting and documentation. And it's a time-stamped photo, unless a farmer is really like gaming the system and like, sending a photo of
pretending.
Like, why would a farmer
photoshopped in?
Yeah, exactly. It would take so much more work to do that than to just put compost on. So that's some of the things they pay for. They also have a really cool element of their program that's an alternative manure management program that actively pays farmers to move from sort of liquid manure storage to composting of manure and kind of more solid manure management strategies that are good for soil and good for emissions emissions and all that kind of stuff. So they are ahead of us, just not in terms of PES per se. But also their program is paid for by Cap and Trade because they have a Cap and Trade program in California.
I was going to ask how that was funded. Yeah.
So we don't have a funding mechanism for better or worse.
That's interesting. So Dan says that he saw a mention of federal PFP funds and philanthropy as potential funding sources. Are those aspirational, or is there traction on either of those fronts?
Well, I'm going to display my ignorance here a little bit. When you say PFP funds, can you say more about what you mean by that? Are you thinking of pay for performance or
pay for performance? Yeah.
Pay for performance. Yeah. Well, there has actually been, I think it's out of its pilot stage now, but there is a program that's federally funded that is a pay for performance phosphorus program that essentially does what we're talking about, but just for phosphorus reductions, where farmers are paid for measurable, reductions in phosphorus coming off of their farms. And that's paid for, I think, through RCPP, which is the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. That's like a big, $5 million federal grant. So there has been some amount of that funding that's gone toward that program. I don't know that there's been any more conversation about using those types of funds to pay for what we're talking about. I don't think it's impossible. But the other thing I'll just say is a big question around this is that I didn't even touch on is who administers this program, right? Is this a program that's administered by the Agency of Ag, who is on the one hand a regulator that farms are used to working with and probably have in a lot of cases an existing relationship with, but they're still a regulator. Agency of Natural Resources, who is also a regulator, who farms generally don't have an existing relationship. And if they do, it's generally not a great one. Unfortunately, there is like a lot of real angst oftentimes between the Agency of Ag and Natural Resources in Vermont, which I wish was not the case. And or is there kind of a third option that would be kind of a service provider organization like the Housing and Conservation Board? They run the Farm and Forest Viability Network that really works with a lot of different service providers, one of which is us at NOFA, to provide technical assistance to farmers. And personally, I would love to see it run through that kind of support organization, because I feel like that's more what this program is. It's not a regulatory program, right? It's a program that's trying to actively support farms in improving their stewardship. So I think how the program is funded and kind of who administers it are sort of questions that go hand in hand. And I do think it will likely be some kind of public-private partnership in terms of the funding, but again, we haven't really worked that out yet.
Yeah.
Wish I had better answers for you on some of these things.
Well, it's a work in progress. And, as you've pointed out a couple times, I think really owning and committing to an iterative process is likely going to be so important for success, because, even best intentions, you don't necessarily get it right. So like planning in reflection and pivot points along the way, I think is really, I would imagine would be critical to long-term, like longevity of this kind of program.
Yeah, and that's one thing we've talked about in terms of this kind of biodiversity focused, or sometimes people refer to that as kind of the whole farm approach, because it mostly, I think it largely, if a focus on biodiversity will incorporate some areas outside of just the farm fields. So we've referred to that as sort of the whole farm approach, and that it can incorporate the edges of fields, buffer zones, even spaces like along a driveway, or, outside of a greenhouse where you could plant a pollinator strip or something like that. But again, this idea of incorporating biodiversity is really challenging for some people in the working group and outside of it, I think, because it feels really complicated to measure and to really do well. So I think that there might be a version of the program in the pilot, for example, that addresses biodiversity in some limited sense. And then hopefully as farmers start to sign up and go like, oh, okay, I can do this. This makes sense to me. This is my hope. I see how to do this. I can take a walk around my farm as I'm doing my daily chores, right? And sort of start to document some of these things. And then hopefully we can sort of add in some of those additional layers of complexity to really make it more meaningful and stronger over time.
Yeah, for me, and you and I talked about this a little bit sort of in preparation for today's session, but the the biodiversity piece, just to tie it back to the soil and sort of compost piece, that's something that makes so much sense to me and that I personally talk about in the trainings that I do a lot. So thinking about diversity of feedstocks, diversity of the biology, and different styles of composting that sort of can either promote or be more bacterial or fungal dominant composts. But all of that diversity, and really what I see as a soil scientist is diversity underground reflects diversity above ground and vice versa, because there are all kinds of specialized soil biology that will come and will be supported with a diverse plant life, and vice versa. And so the whole biodiversity front, just for me anyway, personally makes a whole lot of sense. And I would love to see that sort of promoted and pushed forward, even if it's stepwise,
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of been my vision for the trajectory of this program. And also just like what I think our work at NOFA is really focused on in general is building, a foundational of organic is feed the soil, not the crop. So everything in organic is really supposed to be based in this foundation of making sure that you do have biologically diverse, thriving, living soil that then feeds into healthy crops, healthy animals, healthier people, healthy ecosystems. And so similarly in this program, we get a lot of like, when we get pushback around the biodiversity idea, it's like, how do you define that? Are you talking about in the soil, above ground? Like what level of biodiversity are you talking about? And I think to begin with, looking at biodiversity both underground and above ground, just at the plant level, like you're saying, is sort of, they are mutually reciprocal. And I think they're good indicators that like you do have a biologically diverse system. But then I do think that sort of like more landscape scale of what kind of natural areas, what kind of landforms do you have on your property, that those really get into that, like those questions of wildlife habitat and connectivity, and starting to think bigger picture about, your farm system isn't operating in a silo. It is connected to everything else. And so I would love to see more biodiverse farms underground, above ground, at that landscape scale, and even on the human level, right? We need different kinds of farms. We need more people working the land, not less. So that's kind of everything we do at NOFA, I think, is trying to work toward those goals.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because when I think of ecosystem function, I like highly functioning ecosystems at that system level are almost by definition, or are by definition diverse, right? Like there has to be diversity to be highly functioning.
Right.
And John just added in chat that nature is a flywheel. Good foundation can lead to amazing results. So for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's how I think about this. I just think there is such opportunity here that it doesn't, like I said, I don't think it has to be excessively complicated. Every time we bring up the biodiversity idea and the sort of whole farm approach, all the farmers in the working group and other farmers that like I've talked to are really excited about that, because they do see, I think when farmers are managing the land, they see all these opportunities and they see areas of their farm that like, are underutilized, for example, that aren't necessarily growing a crop that could be doing something productive for the land and to help their farm management and to help the ecosystem. So I do think when I talk to farmers about this, they tend to just get it because they are seeing how those things interact on a really day-to-day basis that like folks in offices are not necessarily seeing.
Yeah. Or less concerned maybe about what the metrics exactly would be, like how do we measure? How do we, how do we fit something like that into a transactional kind of system? And I could see that being an obstacle. So John also says WOOFs are a great opportunity to volunteer on organic farms nationwide, and actually beyond the nation. Where some of the farmers who we're partnering with in Cavs project spent years volunteering actually in other countries as well, and have brought back some of that experience and skills learned to local farming here. So.
Well, and that's one of the other things I actually was thinking about as we were discussing that I didn't mention in terms of the farmer insights, I don't think, but one of the things that came up a lot in those interviews and that survey that the group did with farmers is that reliance on sort of farmer to farmer learning, and the idea of, really farmers learn most effectively generally from each other. And so that I think needs to be built into this as well. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be directly a part of this program. But I think making sure that we're continuing to fund facilitation of that kind of learning is really important and has always been kind of core to what we do at NOFA, especially in our farmer services team. We have a lot of different cohorts and a lot of different programs, like our Journey Farmer program, which is where beginning farmers are paired with a mentor in terms of practices and business planning support and markets and that kind of thing. And then we have a program called Soil Health Stewards that just started a couple of years ago. That I think the first cohort was all livestock producers. And the idea was just sort of to create this community of learning around soil health, and farms visited each other's farms and they had regular meetings where they talked about what they were doing and what was challenging. And we had brought in speakers, specifically to talk about topics that they wanted to tackle. And we saw a ton of, we actually started it in memory of Jack Laser of Butterworks when he passed away. With some donation money. And we found both from the philanthropy side, folks were really excited to give money to that program, and farmers were really excited to participate in it. So I think more of that sort of cohort learning model could be a really big part of what makes this program work well also.
Absolutely. Yeah. In some work that I was involved with before the Composting Association of Vermont, we were working with farmers at higher altitudes and climate change adaptation. And really, when that program sort of started to get traction and actually have meaningful changes in practice was when, the group of us who were facilitating got out of the way and just brought farmers from around the world who are all farming and experiencing the impacts of climate change and weather patterns. Like, we just got out of the way and brought them together. And that's when things really took off. And it really is the people who are on the land experiencing it and intimately involved in managing those landscapes are the ones who, often have much more to share with each other and lessons learned there. So for sure.
Absolutely. That's such a good observation, that getting out of the way is sometimes what we have to do, or just facilitating that gathering. So sometimes that
exactly. Yeah,
we're actually in the process of hiring at NOFA like a climate resilience specialist on our farmer services team, and that will be a lot of their role, is just like developing those cohorts specifically targeted at farm climate resilience.
Sort of holding the space but not taking up the space.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Nice. Well, I could continue just having this conversation forever. I love this. And thanks to all of our participants. I'm not seeing a lot more questions in the chat, and we are just about at time. So I'm actually going to just pull up my final sort of slideshow bits and share my screen again.
And I'll just put, Natasha,
please.
Email in the chat for everybody. So if anybody wants to get in touch or learn more about this or get looped in. The other thing I should share, I'm just going to type this in and hope I get it right, but there is a website for the PES working group that you can go to if anybody is ever interested in coming to a meeting. All the meetings are on Zoom and they are public, and there's always time for public comment. So if anybody really wants to dig in and kind of hear what the discussions are, our next one should be in, 2 Tuesdays, but it'll be on that website. So check that out if you want to really dig into this a little bit more. You're very welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Maddie. And I'll be sure to post those as well when I post the recording of this session. So just a little reminder to folks, if you're able to come back and join us this afternoon at 1, we're going to be hearing from the Agency of Agriculture the ins and outs of on-farm food scrap composting. I share food residuals composting is the full title that I missed on this slide here. And that, amongst other things, is really going to be somewhat of an update on Act 41 that passed last year. So thinking about some of the rules that are rulemaking that's going to be coming up around food residual composting on farms. But I do know as well they're going to be talking about some other like invasive species and the jumping worms and some other on-farm composting sort of on-farm topics as well. So join us for that if you're able. Maddie, thank you so much. It's a pleasure as always. I was super excited that you were able to join us this year and share what you've been working on. And thank you to all of our participants for joining us this morning.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And thanks everybody for your good questions and engagement. I appreciate it. Have a great rest of your summit, Natasha.
Thanks so much. Take care, everybody.